You're alive! Take a look around. Yeah? Look up. Look down. Over here. Confused? Do you think this is a good idea? Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'll have to think about that. Are you worried we're gonna crash? Yeah. I love flying FPV with wireless head tracking on planes, but I can count on one hand the opportunities that we've had to do that this year because of relentless 20 mph plus winds. But a quad can fly no problem in the wind, and I've always wanted to add head tracking to a quad just to see what it's like and to give me some options as the weather seems to be getting worse as we approach winter. So I took an old iFlight Deadcat DC5 frame, designed and 3D printed some brackets out of PETG on my H2D printer, and decided to use the Walksnail GM3 gimbal along with the Avatar HD Goggles X and the Moonlight VTX kit, thinking this would be the easiest option. However, I was completely wrong because there are so many gotchas. The first one being that I did a hover test with the Moonlight kit installed and the VTX burnt out straight away and just stopped working. It gets so hot in standby mode, which is why I made my brackets out of PETG, and after a bit of research, the VTX dying on the Moonlight is a very common problem, so I personally will not be recommending it. The next gotcha is if you were an early adopter of the Goggles X, then the head tracker just doesn't work, and you have to buy the bulky bodged add-on that they came up with for it. However, if your goggles box has this sticker that says head tracker included, then you should be good to go, but you're not. The GM3 gimbal doesn't come with the firmware update cable, so you have to buy that separately. You also need to update the head tracker firmware built into the goggles. This is because both the gimbal and head tracker is made by a different company called XF Robot, and they are constantly improving the gimbal and head tracker features. For example, when the gimbal first came out, its FPV mode was always stabilized, and changing the sensitivity of the stabilization didn't have much effect. Now, with the sensitivity turned up, it's almost completely locked, so putting it on a drone or a plane is now more usable. So you need to update the firmware of the gimbal to get this, but also the goggles, and then separately the goggles head tracker, and also whatever VTX you use so that they will all work together. And this is all very messy, especially if you were an early adopter because they didn't include the head tracker update jack in the earlier models, and the cable that they give you if you buy the firmware update board from Walksnail is wrong for the Goggles X. It only has 4 elements to it, whereas the Goggles X cable has 5 elements that goes into the goggle side and 4 elements that goes into the update board. So with the failure of the Moonlight kit, I decided to use the Dual Pro VTX, despite it not being a V2 Avatar VTX, and it's not listed as being supported by the GM3 gimbal. It does, however, have the new separate UART, and it does actually work with the GM3 gimbal. So I powered the gimbal and the Pro VTX straight from the 6S VBAT on the iFlight flight controller, ensuring that the powertrain has a capacitor installed on it because the Avatar VTXs support 6S, but the max 6S voltage, so 25.2 volts, so any voltage spikes that you may get from your ESCs may send the voltage over that and kill the VTX. And I have a capacitor installed, so this isn't what killed the Moonlight, and the Pro has been absolutely fine. I think the Moonlight is just a bad design. It gets really hot, probably needs a fan. The independent 4K video recorder, when that is just working on its own with the VTX dead, it still gets incredibly hot. I had to mount the Pro VTX in the middle of the frame because the MIPI connector on the GM3 cable isn't long enough. And even though I haven't shown it here, taking the back of the camera off and installing it in the gimbal, along with attaching the gimbal to the VTX, attaching the antenna's UFL connectors, is all a massive faff and very fiddly, on top of all of the previous gotchas that I've mentioned. Now, Banggood have sent me the XF Robot version of this, which can also support DJI O2, O3, and now O4. With Walksnail's MIPI connector being the same as O2, they've basically piggybacked off XF Robot's DJI implementation. The XF Robot solution doesn't require you to have a 3D printer as it comes with its own mounting plate, although you could make your own mounts out of plywood for the Walksnail system, I suppose. Interestingly, it seems that XF Robot has updated their wireless transmission system. When it first came out, they were using a 10-year-old 2.4 GHz radio link protocol, which I personally would not trust in terms of range. But this package has come with a LoRa-labeled transmission system, which is interesting. But the antenna is still a 2.4 GHz size, so I'd recommend using 868 or 900 MHz for your controlling to stop any interference if you want to try this wireless system from XF Robot. I've made a video on the standalone XF Robot head tracker before, and it's brilliant, but I used it in a single wired configuration directly to my transmitter to give me more options, such as being able to disable the head tracker if you get into trouble, or you could have the stabilization sensitivity on a potentiometer, or even just have the pan and tilt on sliders instead. But all you can do with the Walksnail system is triple press a button on the goggles to recenter the gimbal, which means taking your hand off the sticks, by which time you may have already have crashed. Now, there is a firmware which they put out that adds a double press to disable the head tracker, which is great, but they've pulled that firmware because of another problem. And also, you know, taking your hands off of the sticks to press any button on your goggle while you're flying certainly a 5-inch drone is not my preference anyway. Really, this gimbal is more suited to RC cars, which you see a lot of adverts about when it comes to this Walksnail system. That's simply because they don't have control of completely turning the stabilization off. But I would say it is good enough now to a point where it's not going to make you sick. But really, if you're putting it on a plane, then you will want a flight controller in the middle in case you get into trouble. What we really need is the stabilization to be completely off for it to be 100% useful on a plane. Back to Walksnail, and setting up the gimbal with the right channels through the configurator isn't easy either. So while I like what Walksnail has done here, it's no easier than using a bag gimbal along with a standalone XF Robot head tracker or a Arduino head tracker. And really, Walksnail are bound to whatever XF Robot comes up with firmware-wise. The stabilization is not completely locked, but it's almost there. The problem is XF Robot historically are a camera drone gimbal company, so the GM3 gimbal, or the C-20T as they call it, is very much a repurposed camera drone gimbal, which is why it doesn't completely satisfy our needs yet. Now I can sense the comments already. Andy, why do this? And one crash and that gimbal gets obliterated, which is true. I've done this for fun, and also potentially if I turn the stabilization sensitivity down so it stabilizes the gimbal more, and disable the head tracking with a slight tilt on a slider on my GX12, you could potentially have a nice cine cruiser, especially with the DJI-04 in place of Walksnail, and not have to use Rocksteady or Gyroflow to get that nice stabilization. But that's a video for another time, perhaps. Okay, head tracking on a 5-inch quad. What could go wrong? Now, I was hoping to test fly this first in angle mode, but we have 20-mile-per-hour winds here. So, angle mode, I think it would just get pushed away. Well, straight away, I think the issue that we're going to have is you're not going to tell if I'm turning my head or turning the quad. So I turn the quad there, not my head. If I'm turning my head, the prop should be in view. Now the issue that I can see straight away is it's great having a clear view in front, but I've got no reference to forward. So having a bit of the framing shot at the bottom would definitely help. And of course, when we move forward with a quad, we have camera angle on, but here I can change the camera angle and it's not exactly smooth looking. Yeah, I can imagine that is going to seem quite strange looking back, because it's like, is he turning his head or is the quad moving? Well, it's doing both there. All I have to reference what is straight is looking down, but there doesn't seem to be any drift in this gimbal. But of course I have to keep my head still, because the props are quite far back. So it's a dead cat model. That's a pretty wild shot though. I think if you wanted to do this, then don't do your first flight in 20-mile-per-hour winds, because I'm having to put on some angle just to keep it in a hover, and the wind is about that way. See me looking down there. I probably don't have to do that. That's me turning the quad. That's me turning my head. As I suspected though, because quads are just so much better in wind anyway, and stabilization with the flight controller, you can't completely turn the stabilization off, but it's not causing a problem with the flight. Like I say, it's so stable anyway, so if I sort of just wiggle, we've got the slightest bit of stabilization going on. Of course, we are used to seeing, though, quad footage look incredibly smooth. And I don't think it's going to look smooth here. It's a bit like in a roll. I'm going to do a slow roll. Not too bad. Because I don't want to put the gimbal to its limits, and I've turned the horizon tilt off because I just didn't want that as a problem. So all I've got is pan and tilt. Literally just disabled the horizon change in the gimbal settings. Man, the wind is absolutely crazy here. Trying to lift my head up so I've got a better camera angle. This Avatar system has definitely improved, but it seems like there's exposure problems still. So I'm looking at the horizon there, and it's blown out. But if I look up, it just appears. That's a wild view. Kind of needs the battery underslung really, so that the battery isn't in shot. But then I'd be landing on the battery, which I don't like to do. Now, because we've got this crazy wind as well, I can't tell if, you know, I'm not centered, or is it that the wind's pushing, and I think it's just the wind pushing. It's very hard to keep my head straight or adjust the camera angle for forward movement. There we go, I've kind of done it there. Kind of. I do feel task saturated here. And ironically, I wanted to do this because I couldn't fly a plane with head tracking with today's wind. And I can fly this, but it's not without its challenges. It needs a piece there extending out forwards, just so I've got some reference of what straight is, because I can slightly turn my head. All right, I see the prop there. But yeah, there's quite a big dead band of where I could actually be flying sideways. There doesn't seem to be any drift in this head tracker on the Goggles X goggles there. Can I do a backflip? I'm really scared about sending the gimbal to its extremes. I was just paying attention to what that lorry was doing. We haven't had a dry day for a while, even though it's windy, and so yeah, farmers doing farming things. That's a wild shot, but I need to aviate first, I think. Yeah, it's not going to be the smoothest of footage, this. What you could do though is you could set this up to just have the PWM on a tilt, so you could just adjust your camera angle, and then theoretically, you know, you wouldn't be able to look around, but you would always sort of know that you were in the center flying forwards. Because I'm so used to flying head tracking with planes, I have a tendency to, when I turn, I also want to turn my head. But of course then we don't know if we're going straight. Man, that wind is making it so hard. Yeah, definitely some potential with this though. Let's go for a backflip and a roll, but not too fast. Because I think the gimbal has like a limit on it, and I don't want to reach that. Yeah, we're going forward still, but that's my battery, so there you go. Not the most dignified of maidens for sort of semi-stabilized head tracking on a 5-inch quad. Be better on like a 7-inch with something in the front for frame of reference to know that you are going forward, because I'm crosswind now trying to land, and yeah, I don't know if it's because my head has drifted slightly or the wind is pushing me. It's probably just the wind, but anyway, let's try and come back in for a landing. Look at this guy here, he's terrified. If it wasn't so windy, I'd be able to look around more, but there you go. That's the maiden of head tracking on a 5-inch model with the GM3 gimbal. Yeah, definitely gonna take some getting used to flying like this. It's weird flying a quad and being able to look down and up. So I thought I'd go for a fly with the gimbal's PTZ mode in the off position. And this is kind of the problem, relying solely on the Walksnail wireless transmission for the gimbal control. I'm on the latest stable version of the firmware. They released a new firmware and then pulled it, and it's a shame. It had some problems with the recording and other things and losing binds and stuff. But that version of the firmware that was to be released had a new feature where you could press a button 3 times on the goggles and it would disable the gimbal like it is now. The only problem with that, of course, I'm not on that firmware, so I couldn't do that. But the camera is in a completely flat configuration, and of course when we want to fly forwards with quads, we have to point down like that, and would normally angle our camera upwards. And with the Walksnail, system, you can't do that. What you could do is I could remap, say, an LED pad for a single PWM to give me camera tilt on a slider. So I'm using my GX12 radio here. And what that may give you is some nice gimbal stabilization. I don't know. It does look a little bit jerky through the goggles when I'm doing these rolls there. That could be the tune. That's kind of the other problem with this. You put all of this on here, quite difficult to properly tune it. Now this is a dead cat, and usually need a little bit of difference with the tuning. And because the gimbal is always stabilizing, then difficult to know you've got a decent tune. But stock Betaflight PIDs here, you're gonna get something okay, and the motors aren't getting hot or anything like that. Another thing I've thought about is on the gimbal itself, I think PWM1 also accepts a CRSF input. I just wonder if you could double up on your crossfire receiver and then have everything go through the radio. I mean, that's always my preference, is to have everything go through the radio. Then you can set up an OD switch. You can, change your gains from your transmitter, so you don't need a laptop. Disable the gimbal, or even just have, like I was saying, the PWM to control the gimbal on sliders. But there you go. This is what I have today. And I can't go very fast because that's into wind. It's funny though, now everything is locked, I'm trying to move my head around. I also don't think gyro flow would work, because I believe on the Walksnail system, the gyro data, I could be wrong, but if the gyro data is in the VTX and not the camera, well, the camera's slightly been stabilized already, isn't it, with the gimbal, so it wouldn't match, I don't think. But the idea of having, slight stabilization on a gimbal is, maybe you get the full field of view without the need to sort of crop in to use gyro flow. I don't know. We'll have to look at the footage and you tell me, I suppose. Because now essentially we are just flying with hypersmooth, kind of. And it's definitely flyable, of course. I need camera angle because I'm looking at the ground most of the time. But I suppose the question is, the footage, acceptable enough? Let's try and get downwind so that we can sort of get flat. Now, I actually have the sensitivity of the stabilization on the gimbal set to the highest, which is 15. And that means it's not actually stabilizing that much. I didn't want any stabilization for head tracking. So that's really, when you're doing head tracking, you don't want extra movement, you know. Just like with the planes, that's why we use servos for the pan and tilt. So there's no stabilization. And I've contacted XF Robot, who makes this gimbal, and they work with Caddx, but it is the same gimbal. I've said, you know, especially for fixed wing FPV, you would sell so many more of these if you could just take the stabilization off completely, so we can just have a pan tilt and also the horizon tilt, because that would be a cool thing to have in a plane. But you know, with this slight stabilization, I just don't like it on a plane, which is why I've put it on a quad first. Oh, the sun has come out. Well, I'm not seeing any jello in the footage, so that's good. This Walksnail system has improved, but I wouldn't put it, I still don't think I'd put it higher than the DJI-02, you know, the original Vista, Caddx Vista and Air unit. I think in terms of like the dynamic range, it's not as good. And sort of, you know, the picture is nice, you know, there's less grass smudging. And of course you've got more options with this than you have with the V1 system. You can't buy the V1 system anymore, but you can find it very cheap on eBay. Very cheap, in fact. I think we bought a set of V1 goggles with an A unit for about 108 quid, and you know, you couldn't even buy cheap analog box goggles for that, or you'd struggle anyway. So no excuse for not at least trying digital, even though, you know, DJI doesn't make that anymore. There's plenty of people who want the latest and greatest, but in my opinion, you know, I still prefer the V1 for the big screen on the goggles, the comfy goggles, the fact that you can see the entire screen. Sort of going off a bit topic now, but you know, just around those trees there in the goggles DVR getting smearing, and you would not get that even with the V1 DJI system. The way that it handles the breakup is still not as good, I don't think, as the DJI V1, even though, you know, there's this 1080p mode. But, yeah, having fun here, but that's my battery. So yeah, this is basically just, you know, okay, just putting, giving you sort of hyper smooth, really, I suppose. That's the idea. The equivalent of putting sort of like an Osmo Pocket and flying through it on a quad. So that's something else that you could do. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments about all of this. And as always, thanks so much for watching. Please continue to subscribe. Cheers.